There is a man who has attended every funeral held in the town of Ashford for the last 55 years, and to this day nobody quite agrees on why. Not the grand funerals, mind, the ones half the town turns out for, those anyone might attend. This is every funeral. The vast ones at Maple Street Church, with the pews packed 3 deep, and the threadbare ones, the ones for people who outlived every friend they ever had, where 2 or 3 mourners rattle around in a nave built for 200, and the vicar's voice comes back to him off the empty stone. It does not matter who has died, or how well they were loved, or whether anyone in Ashford could tell you their first name. The same man is there. Same dark coat, same seat, last pew on the left, hands folded, eyes down. He arrives a few minutes before it starts, and he is gone before anyone thinks to look for him at the reception. For 55 years, this has simply been a fact of life in Ashford, the way weather is a fact of life, noticed, remarked on occasionally, never quite explained. His name is Walter Voss, and he is 71 years old, and until a young woman with a notebook and a stubborn curiosity went looking for the reason 3 summers ago, most of Ashford could not have told you a single other thing about him, beyond the one thing everyone already knew, which was that wherever there was a coffin in this town, Walter Voss would be somewhere near the back of the room, watching it go by. There are, naturally, theories. There have always been theories, because a town cannot sit for 55 years next to a mystery this patient without inventing something to fill the silence. Some of the older residents will tell you with real conviction that Walter is a distant relation of half the families in the county, quietly checking in on inheritances nobody else remembers he has a claim to, though nobody has ever produced a single instance of Walter so much as approaching a solicitor's office. Others say he simply likes funerals, the way some men like weather or trains, a harmless and slightly unsettling hobby, and leave it there, because it is easier to file a man under odd than to actually ask him a question. The children of Ashford, for 2 generations running, have told each other in hushed voices that the man in the back pew is Death himself, come to make sure the job was done properly, and have thrilled themselves silly with the idea on the walk home from church. None of the theories are true. All of them, in their own clumsy way, are reaching for the same thing, which is an explanation for a kindness so large and so quiet that nobody in Ashford has known how to see it as a kindness at all. Ashford has always been quick to notice who's missing from a room. It counts the empty chairs at a table without meaning to. It knows always exactly who didn't come to the wedding, who wasn't at the christening, whose name got left off the guest list, and why. What this town has never been especially good at, what this story is in the end about, is noticing who quietly shows up, who fills the empty chair nobody thought to fill. For 55 years, one man did exactly that, funeral after funeral, and Ashford was so busy being curious about the strangeness of it that it never once got around to being grateful. To understand Walter Voss, you first have to understand what he did for a living, because it turns out to be the same thing, wearing 2 different coats. For 41 years, until the presses finally went digital and put men like him out of a trade that had lasted centuries, Walter set type for the Ashford Gazette. Not the news pages, the back pages. He was, for 4 decades, the man who set the obituaries, working the small hot metal composing frame in the back room of the Gazette building on Church Row, lifting each letter of each name by hand from the case and locking it into the block that would, the next morning, print a life into 200 words for the rest of the town to read over their tea. He set the obituary of nearly every person who died in Ashford between the year he started, in his early 20s, and the year the paper went over to computers. That is a great many names. That is, by one estimate a local historian worked out for Nora's piece, somewhere in the region of 4,000 people, laid out, letter by letter, under Walter Voss's own 2 hands, long before most families had finished grieving them. There's something in that work that most people never think about, which is that a compositor does not merely print a name, he handles it. He reads the whole small life of a stranger, born where, married whom, survived by which children, remembered for what kindness, while his fingers pick out each letter one at a time, slower than reading, slower than almost anything, so that by the time the obituary is set and inked and ready for the morning edition, the compositor has spent longer with that life than most of the mourners will spend at the funeral itself. Walter did this, quietly, in the back room of the Gazette for 41 years, and it left him with something nobody else in Ashford had, an intimate, unhurried, letter-by-letter knowledge of nearly everyone this town had lost. He knew who they were survived by. He knew, from the small print he set week after week, which families had scattered and which had stayed, whose obituary listed 6 grandchildren and whose listed none at all, whose notice would draw a church full of mourners and whose, he could already tell from the sparse column of names, would not. He was 15 years old, and it was the winter of 1971, when Walter Voss first found out exactly what an empty funeral looks like from the inside, because it was his mother's. Elsie Voss had come to Ashford when Walter was 9, the 2 of them alone, with 2 suitcases, and no explanation the town was ever given, and none it was owed. She took in sewing to make a living, mending, alterations, a wedding dress now and then for a family that could not afford the shop in the next town over. And she was, by every account that survives of her, a careful and gentle and closely private woman who kept to herself in a way that a small town, whatever it says about welcoming strangers, rarely forgives. She did not go to church socials. She did not know the right people to know. She worked with her head down and her door mostly shut. And Ashford, never cruel to her exactly, simply never troubled itself to find out who she was, and so filed her, the way it filed everything it did not understand, under outsider, and left her there for 6 years. She died in the February of 1971 of a fever that turned, in the space of a bad week, into something the doctor could not fix. And Walter, 15 and suddenly entirely alone in the world, buried his mother on a grey Tuesday at the small chapel that used to stand at the edge of the Ashford cemetery before the newer church was built. He remembers, he told Nora Bishop many years later, that it was cold enough that his breath fogged inside the chapel because there were not enough people in the room to warm it. There was the vicar, there was the undertaker's man standing near the door out of duty rather than grief, and there was Walter, 15 years old, sitting alone in the front pew of a room built for 100, listening to his own footsteps echo when he had to walk up to say the one thing he could manage, with nobody behind him to hear it but 2 men who had never met his mother at all. Nobody came. Not because Ashford hated Elsie Voss. Nobody had thought about her enough to hate her. She had simply never been let all the way in, and so when she left, Nobody felt the tug of an absence, because as far as most of the town was concerned, there had been nothing there to begin with. Walter sat in that cold and nearly empty chapel and understood, with the terrible clarity that grief sometimes hands a person all at once, that his mother's whole life, 6 years of careful stitching, of quiet kindness to whichever neighbour needed a hem taken up for free, of raising a son entirely on her own in a town that never once asked her to stay for tea, had been reduced, in the town's own accounting, to a room with 3 people in it. And he made himself a promise there, 15 years old, in a chapel too cold and too empty for a boy to be alone in it. He did not tell anyone the promise for over 50 years, but he kept it. The promise was simple, and Walter Voss, who was not a complicated man, kept it simply. Nobody would ever again be buried in this town to an empty room, not while he had the legs to walk to the chapel and the manners to sit quietly in the back and not make a fuss of himself. He did not decide to become known for it. He decided very specifically the opposite, that he would attend and say nothing and take no credit and expect no thanks, because the whole point, the entire shape of the promise, was that it should cost the grieving family nothing and ask nothing of them in return. He simply began going to every funeral, starting with the very next one Ashford held, a farmer he'd never met, 6 mourners in the pews, and Walter Voss in the back row making 7. 1 more person than would otherwise have been there. 1 more pair of eyes making sure a life had been witnessed leaving the world, not merely disposed of. He kept this up, without exception, that anyone has ever found, for 55 years. Through his 20s, at the composing frame, setting the very obituaries of the people whose funerals he would attend 2 mornings later. Through a marriage, he was married briefly in his 30s, to a woman named Constance, who by all accounts loved him and could never quite understand the funerals, and who left, not unkindly, some years in, telling a friend once that she had married a good man with one strange devotion she had never been let close enough to understand. Through the slow decades after that, alone in a small house on the edge of town, working his shift at the Gazette and going every week or 2, sometimes more, to sit in the back of whichever church or chapel Ashford was using that day, for whoever Ashford had lost that week. It was Nora Bishop who finally worked out why, and she found it, of all places, in the church's own record books. Nora was 27, 3 years into a job at the Gazette that mostly meant council meetings and the county fair, and she had been handed, that particular summer, the job of putting together a special section for the paper's 100th anniversary, a look back, a century of Ashford in its own headlines. It was dull, careful work mostly, until she found herself one afternoon in the vestry of the Maple Street Church, going through the old guest registers the parish had kept for well over a century, the leather-bound books where every funeral, every wedding, every christening had its mourners and guests sign their names in ink, going back further than anyone now living could remember. She was looking for something else entirely, a note about a fire in the old chapel, a name for a photograph, when she noticed, without quite meaning to, that one signature appeared on nearly every single funeral page she turned to. Not every wedding, not the christenings. Every funeral going back decades, the same steady, old-fashioned hand, the same 2 initials low on the page near the bottom of a guest list that was sometimes 6 names long and sometimes 60. There's a detail most people miss when they're looking at a long pattern up close, which is that the pattern is usually easiest to see from a little further back. And Nora, sitting on the vestry floor with a century of registers open around her, finally stepped back far enough to see it. She began pulling books at random, decades apart, funerals for people she'd never heard of, families long since moved away or died out entirely. And there it was, again and again, W.V., low on the page, in ink that had faded from black to brown with the years, but never once stopped appearing. 60 years of funerals at a rough count, and the same signature at nearly all of them. More consistent than the vicar's own, more consistent than the church itself, which had at least once been rebuilt. She asked Reverend Alsop, who has kept those Maple Street books for the better part of 2 decades and inherited them from a man who kept them before him, and the Reverend, when she showed him what she'd found, was quiet for a moment, and then said, not unkindly, that he had always assumed everybody knew about Walter, the way you assume everybody already knows about the weather. Nora had not known. She had lived in Ashford her whole life and had genuinely never once wondered about the quiet older man who sat in the back of every service she'd ever attended. Because a town teaches its children, without ever meaning to, exactly which mysteries are worth asking about and which ones you simply learn to stop seeing. It took her 3 weeks to work up the nerve to actually knock on Walter Voss's door, and when she did, he did not want to talk to her. He was polite about it. Walter was, by every account, an unfailingly polite man. But he told her plainly, standing in his own doorway with his hands still on the frame, that whatever she thought she'd found, it wasn't a story, and that he would consider it a real kindness if she let it alone. Nora almost did. She has said since that what changed her mind was not stubbornness, so much as a feeling that letting it alone would be its own kind of unfairness. That a man who had spent 55 years making sure other people were not forgotten had in the process made himself almost entirely invisible, and that there was something wrong about that, something the town owed a correction to, whether Walter wanted the correction or not. She went back 3 times. On the 3rd visit, she did not bring a notebook at all, and she told him plainly about a great-aunt of her own who had died the year before, with almost nobody at the service, and how it had bothered Nora ever since, in a way she hadn't fully understood until she started finding his name in those old books. And Walter Voss, 71 years old, looked at this young woman standing on his step, with nothing to write with, and no agenda but an honest ache of her own, and something in him that had held for 55 years, finally, quietly, gave a little. He asked her in, and he made 2 cups of tea, neither of them particularly wanted, and he told her about a cold Tuesday in February of 1971, and a chapel with 3 people in it, and a 15-year-old boy who had made himself a promise nobody else would ever know about. He asked her, when he'd finished, not to make a production of it. He did not want, he said, to be the subject of the piece, the sad old man with the sad old story. He wanted, if she had to write anything at all, for the piece to be about the town's own habit of leaving people to grieve alone, and about how easily that habit could be broken by absolutely anyone willing to simply show up. He wanted it, in other words, to be useful, not sentimental. He wanted it to change something, not just move someone. Nora, to her enormous credit, wrote it exactly that way. A short, careful, unshowy piece for the Gazette's anniversary section about a man who had quietly corrected, week after week, for over half a century, the exact failure of attention that this whole town, herself included, had never noticed it was making. She used his name because he'd said she could, but she gave the article almost nothing else about him. No photograph, no dramatics, just the facts, laid out the way Walter himself might have set them in cold metal type. What he had done, how long he had done it, and why. The piece ran on a Thursday, on page 6, without fanfare, exactly as Walter had asked. And here is the part of this story that Ashford will tell you now is the real ending, though Walter himself, when Nora asked him afterward, said only that it had never really been about an ending at all. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no town meeting, no grand gesture, no parade down Church Row in Walter Voss's honor, which is precisely as he would have wanted it, and precisely why what did happen mattered so much more than any of that could have. People simply started coming. Not to every funeral, and Ashford did not overnight become a town that turns out in force for every loss, and nobody should pretend it did. But at the very next funeral, held after Nora's piece ran, and a quiet woman named Doris Whitfield, 91, outlived by nobody the paper could locate, exactly the kind of funeral that for decades would have drawn 3 mourners and Walter Voss making the 4th. And the little chapel at the edge of the cemetery had, by the time the service started, 11 people in the pews. Neighbours who had read the piece on Thursday and thought quietly of their own Doris Whitfields, the ones they'd been meaning to check on. People who had never met the woman being buried, coming anyway, because a stranger in a newspaper article had shown them, without lecturing them about it, exactly what an empty room costs a family, and exactly how little it takes to fill one. Walter was there too, of course, same seat, last pew on the left. But for the first time in 55 years, he was not the only one who had come for a stranger. He sat and watched the little chapel fill in a way he had never once seen it fill for someone with almost nobody left to grieve them. And Nora, who had come as well, not to write anything this time, but simply because she wanted to be there, watched Walter Voss's face during the service and said afterward that she had never seen an expression quite like it. Not pride, not vindication, nothing so simple as either of those. Something closer to relief. The particular relief of a man who has spent 55 years quietly patching a hole in a boat, alone, in the dark, and who watches for the first time someone else pick up a bucket beside him. It has not, in the years since, made Walter's own attendance any less faithful. He still comes to every funeral this town holds, the packed ones, and less often now, the thin ones, because a promise made to an empty chapel in 1971 was never conditional on anyone else keeping it too. But the chapel is a little less empty than it used to be, more often than not, and Walter Voss, 71 and slower on his feet than he once was, leaning now on a plain wooden cane a neighbor made for him, still slips out before the reception, still says almost nothing to anyone, still asks for no thanks and generally receives none directly, because that was always precisely the arrangement he intended. Somewhere in Ashford this week, there is very likely a small, quiet gathering nobody outside it has thought much about. A funeral, a hospital visit, a birthday nobody remembered to mark, and the entire question of whether that room feels less lonely than it might have comes down, as it so often does, not to grand gestures or public sympathy, but to whether one single person decided to simply show up. Ashford spent 55 years being extremely good at noticing who was missing from its rooms, and extremely poor at noticing who was quietly filling them. It has, since a Thursday a few summers back, gotten a little better at the second part. And it got there because one boy in the cold, empty chapel in 1971 decided that the least he could do for the rest of his life was be the person who showed up. There is very likely someone in your own life keeping a promise like that without ever telling you about it. And there is very likely a room somewhere this week that would feel less empty for your presence in it, whether anyone thinks to invite you or not. We'll come back to Ashford soon.